We now have Jen Kulas from Nightingale Housing.
Thanks, Martin. I might bring this down for Shorty. Hi, I'm Jen Kulas, and I'm the Business Development Manager at Nightingale Housing. We exist to deliver sustainable housing that supports the well-being of diverse, resilient communities. And we do this through the delivery of triple bottom line housing at cost. As has been mentioned both by Paul and Pat today, we are seeing a significant period of growth in Melbourne. So the average of 100,000 new Melburnians year on year for the next 3 decades. And what this is doing is kind of forging Melbourne's housing population into kind of 2 key models. The first is that of renters living in the inner city and in the inner ring suburbs. And the other are owner-occupiers living on the city's expanding fringes. And often this is because first home buyers think this is their only kind of accessible entry point into the housing market. So what we get is a series of urban compression happening in the inner city, largely populated by a population of renters and owned by investors overwhelmingly. And to the right here at Craigieburn, some 25 kilometres outside of Melbourne, we get a sprawl. So the kind of primary issue with this is that one's car is located in their garage. We leave, we drive to work, we come home, we do that act over and over again, leaving little opportunity to run into our neighbours. So about 10 years ago, Rob Adams at the City of Melbourne took a look at some housing models around the world where kind of density was being done right in an urban context. And they looked at Rome, at Barcelona, Paris, Amsterdam, New York, and traditionally Melbourne, prior to the rise of private car ownership during the mid-1950s, when it was a series of walkable villages with active ground plane with cafes and restaurants at ground and housing above, all of which was connected by various transport links. So if you look at the current delivery model for housing in Melbourne on the kind of the speculative development model, if you will, financial return far and away is favoured over livability and socially sustainable outcomes. And in 2014, Breathe Architecture kind of embarked on a prototype, if you will, of the Nightingale model. The theory behind the sustainability model for the commons was to build less and give more. And perhaps the easiest way to explain this is through the architectural features. So we removed basement car parking, there's 0 car parking on site, and instead this was replaced with various car parking spaces for each dwelling and a green transport plan. A rooftop laundry was put in place as a shared amenity, and 2 square metres of space was given back to each dwelling. And what we find today is this is the hardest working social space in the building. So whilst it might seem a little bit awkward at first to wash your smalls with your neighbours, it's amazing how quickly that engenders a sense of familiarity and democratisation amongst everybody. We removed the air conditioning and replaced them instead with these light wells and ferneries, ensuring that there could be cross-ventilation into each of the dwellings and saving over $300,000 in the cost plan. We removed the ceiling partitions and any plasterboard, exposing the thermal mass of the floor plates, the concrete floor plates. And this helped to regulate the internal temperature through times of heat and cooling highs and lows, regulating internal temperature and minimising the need for active cooling systems, which really, the active cooling system in here is essentially only the ceiling fan and hydronic heating. We took out the chrome and the tiles from the bathroom, removing the need for toxic glues and adhesives, and instead just exposed the CFC with a 0 VOC water finish. And most importantly, perhaps, all of our buildings in their ongoing life cycle are fossil fuel in operation. So we don't reticulate gas, and we have a strategic partnership with Momentum Energy and Tasmanian Hydro, which means that we can offer green power at an aggregated purchase price cheaper or similar to the cost of black power to our other neighbours in Brunswick. So coming back to this prevailing model of development in Melbourne, what we found was that we achieved affordability in this first building in Brunswick, but only seemingly for the first 24 people that bought in. When it came to reselling, it seemed like affordability was a one-time ticket only. There was born Nightingale 1. Now, there's a kind of one key shift that happens with Nightingale 1, and that's the introduction of the Nightingale caveat, and this means that we can preserve the financial sustainability of the building into perpetuity as dwellings pass between old and new owners. So the caveat basically suggests that if you own a Nightingale apartment, you're welcome to sell it at any time and to anybody you like. We ask only that there's first rights access to the Nightingale waiting list for 30 days before it's passed into the open market, and you're able to sell that apartment for the amount you paid plus the index increase in housing in the suburb. Now, the increase is indexed to housing as opposed to apartment dwellings, so owners still enjoy an uplift over time, but we do find that that's a significant enough deterrent for investors to partake in a Nightingale project. I'd now like to kind of turn my attentions, because Nightingale's traditionally been an urban housing model, how this might apply to the regional context we're discussing today, and through kind of some key trigger questions. The first of which is, how is Nightingale a catalyst for community? So firstly, I've kind of already mentioned that architecturally we attempt to design in social spaces and utility spaces to encourage interaction between residents. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. And these are all the first residents, the 24 families that brought into the Commons in its first iteration. They're ultimately the ones who self-organise and sustain a dynamic and evolving building community. And what we do is, I guess, to try to engender that, is keep each building community to only 70 people maximum. We kind of find and understand that socially we can know the names and anecdotal details of about 150 people. Beyond that, we kind of don't really hope that we'll actually remember someone's mum's name or when their birthday is if we run into them in the lift, and we don't tend to engage. So by capping the size of a building community, we hope to kind of engender that confidence in the residents. With each new building project, we start with an information session. We present what forthcoming project we have and each of the dwellings, and see if people are interested in the community in taking part or in buying into an apartment. Once a building community is formed, we hold a day at the pub or at a nearby restaurant where the future project will be located, so that all the future residents can meet each other some 2 years before we break ground. And these are the residents of Sky House in the forthcoming Nightingale Village. So had a pretty good day that day, one of whom is now a volunteer with us at Nightingale 1, which is pretty good work. Nightingale Housing. And as the building starts to go up, we run building tours with each of the residents. This is coordinated by the wonderful Dominica Watt in our office. So residents can see their new home being built every 4 to 6 weeks and see it come to life. They get to meet the foreman and the superintendent and speak with the architects. And so another key question, I suppose, with the context of new regional cities is how Nightingale might be a mechanism for affordability. As Pat's kind of already touched on, growth can be a difficult period for housing affordability, as we kind of see land scarcity commonly associated. We know that Geelong is the second fastest growing city in Australia, so this seems like a particularly pertinent conversation. Additionally, there has been a lot of suggestion in the media that I've read in the last week that the land value capture is a key mechanism of delivering rail projects, with kind of various suggestions that land values can increase 25 to 40%. So this is kind of an obvious reason why housing affordability might be compromised without intervention. So firstly, we deliver housing at cost, as I've already mentioned. So we don't have the developer margin commonly associated with speculative housing development. When we deliver housing at Nightingale, see if my pointer works, we buy the land at the same cost that a developer does. We pay our consultants and architect the same that a developer does. What we don't do is engage a marketing team, build a display suite, or hire a real estate agent to sell our projects. We simply go out to the community, explain our project, offer them to come by and visit Nightingale 1 and see what we've built before, and we find that we sell them just fine that way. We don't really save much in the construction process. We take out a basement car park, we take out air conditioning, but we put in the best glazing that money can buy, and we add in solar panels and other equipment that cost quite a lot of money. So in the wash, it all kind of comes out the same. But lastly, we don't actually charge any developer margin at all, so we have to cover the 15% return on investment for our equity providers, but beyond that we take a zero return. We offer 20% affordable housing in all future coming Nightingale projects. In Nightingale Village, we're working with community housing providers, Women's Property Initiative and Housing Choices Australia. So they're going to own and operate 20% of the dwellings as affordable housing, which is a minimum of 20% under market, and that'll be done so into perpetuity. We also think that we just do it better together. So we're constantly working to try to find genuine impact investment in Australia, which means concessional returns on finance. That's a very difficult task, but we keep at it. And we're currently working with the ATO to finalise a Bauer Group and model or a build group model, which means that residents will be able to put their own funds in as equity in a future project and save on GST. So potentially 10% off the ticket price of their future home. So how does Nightingale instigate policy change? The Melbourne Integrated Transport Strategy is an undertaking by Melbourne City Council, which is where the Commons and Nightingale 1 are located, which is looking at current transport patterns and hoping to make more sustainable choices for the future in the municipality. As part of this last week, Council voted on a change to car parking laws. So currently in Australia, in every municipality except the City of Melbourne and the City of Sydney, each council requires any future residential development to have a minimum number of car parks. Last week, Melbourne decided that they were actually going to flip that on its head. So there's now a maximum number of car parks allowed in any development, but the minimum is 0. So it's necessary to then provide reasoning as to why residents need car parking rather than justify why they don't. And in such a well-connected municipality, we think it's a wonderful adoption. Given that the Commons and Nightingale 1 both have 0 car parking on site, we hope that we gave a proven example that supported this policy change. What's also interesting in terms of policy change or what we do is in 2014, we built the Commons, and in 2017, Nightingale 1 was built across the street on Florence Street. And what starts to happen when we get beyond the single lot scale is something more emerges. And that's this. This is Florence Street, which we worked in collaboration with a lot of the other residents in surrounding streets to sign a petition. Council ultimately supported our position and closed Florence Street. It's now got a parklet in it. When our neighbour finally builds next door, we're going to close it. They'll rip up the asphalt and actually build a pocket park. But for now, the residents self-organise and hold parties like this. And it's not just residents from the Commons or Nightingale 1, it's also people from neighbouring Breeze Street and Hope Street. So it's really lovely what we start to see when just given a framework for community, people really take it up. The kind of next iteration of this is Nightingale Village. It's going to be 7 buildings by 7 different architects, or at least that was the original plan. The previously mentioned Mark Jakes actually prepared this wonderful site plan, so I have to thank him. These are the 7 sites. And what happens is by collectivising as a precinct, what we've been able to do is create one subterranean car share hub where there'll be 20 EV or electric vehicles supplied by GoGet Car Share. And that meant that we could close the 3 streets here. There'll be a pocket park in Duckett Street at the centre and 2 kind of greened laneways to the north and south. Just before I came this morning, I participated in an event in Moreland. The site furthest north, which was actually going to be a building by WOWA, has actually been purchased by Moreland City Council, and they announced this morning that they'll be building a 2,000 square metre public park to the north of the precinct. So by showing what greening can be done, by really essentially the architecture community, we hope we've prompted this policy change. Nightingale has been part of what we hope will be one of the most successful precinct renewal projects in Melbourne over the last decades, and I think Moreland understand that if they don't purchase this land now, it won't actually be feasible to do so later, and they've made this strategic purchase. So Nightingale in regional Victoria. I get approached all the time about doing projects in regional Australia, around Australia, but predominantly in Victoria. I'm happy to say we're currently exploring a project in Ballarat, so we'll start community engagement in the next few months. It is incredibly difficult, and there's kind of one key factor that's really hard, and that is that the upfront cost to purchase a house and land package at the fringes of Geelong or any regional centre is price comparable to Nightingale apartment purchase. This is a little area on the edge of Geelong in 2009, and this is at today. And whilst it seems as though they're price comparable up front, we actually find that in the long term, the cost of living is substantially different, and vulnerabilities to fluctuations in the price of petrol and utilities mean that dwellers here are a lot more vulnerable than potentially people living in something like a Nightingale community. And this is mainly due to the strategic partnerships we have, not only by collectivising and living in a more dense context, but also, as I mentioned, through a strategic partnership with Momentum Energy, so we buy green power as a collective, which gives us purchase power, and also through a strategic partnership with Go Get Car Share, so we collectivise a car fleet and we share those for those who don't use a car every day. Ultimately, I hope that I've been able to communicate that whilst we are an urban housing provider, we do see that there are many ways in which we could offer something, whether that's through community, preserving affordability, and also through sustainability and ecological sustainability, should we kind of have initiatives like this included in any future visions for regional centres in Victoria. Thank you.
And our next speaker, Catherine Sunderton from